Hey everybody, today we're going to be learning about section 8.9, which is on solid waste disposal. The learning objective for today is that you can describe solid waste disposal methods and that you can also describe the effects of solid waste disposal methods. We have a whole lot of essential knowledge that we're going to gain today, just about the different types of solid wastes, how they're disposed of, methods for dealing with these, landfills, pros and cons, and all that good stuff. So we're going to first start talking about solid waste types and their sources. And the first one is going to be municipal solid waste. And this is basically just like the technical term for like your trash. This is going to be any sort of solid waste that comes from cities. So like households, businesses, schools, etc. And this is going to be stuff like your trash, your litter, your garbage, your refuse, which you might hear that term sometimes in APES, and that's just going to be, again, like your trash, litter, garbage, that kind of stuff. Now, if we look at what actually makes up your typical municipal solid waste, this diagram is going to be showing what that is usually made of. Now, one of the things that you might see is that actually in reality of what's thrown away, about a third of it is paper, which is stuff that could be recycled. And about 2/3 is going to be organics, which are things that could be compostable, like yard trimmings, food, wood, and all of that. And so literally, if we're looking at this entire pie chart, only a small sliver of this is going to be stuff that could not be like recycled or composted. And so I want you to kind of keep that in mind when we are talking about like all the methods for this, but also thinking about kind of the future and why recycling and composting programs are important. Now, there is a specific type of waste that you need to be aware of, and that's e-waste, which is just like electronic waste. That's going to be stuff like old computers, TVs, phones, tablets, batteries. Now, only about 2% of our municipal solid waste is considered hazardous waste due to metals like cadmium, lead, mercury, all these like fireproofing chemicals that are going to be existing in this e-waste. Oops, sorry. And one of the other things with e-waste is that it can leach endocrine disrupting chemicals out of landfills if thrown away with the regular municipal solid waste. And so this is why it's really important and why all municipal solid waste setups have a specific way that you're supposed to get rid of e-waste. So it needs to be disposed of at like special facilities that recycle all of these parts that can be hazardous. And so just a shout out, make sure that if you have like computers, batteries, stuff that you're trying to get rid of, make sure that you're disposing of it properly, because this is one that can introduce a lot of hazardous material into our landfills if it is not being disposed of properly. So sanitary landfills, this is like the technical APES lingo for landfills. So this is going to be places where developed nations are going to dispose of trash. Now, I know a lot of times when people just talk about landfills, they usually call it a dump, but dumps are just going to be areas where trash is dumped. It doesn't have the proper like landfill features that I'm going to go through here. In developed nations, we have landfills. In developing nations, there are going to often be dumps where people literally just like pile up their waste, but sanitary landfills are going to be referring to these ones here that have these like special features for how to properly be dealing with this waste. Now, the first thing that they have is clay or a plastic bottom liner. So if we look at our diagram here, it's this like black part of this like pentagon shape. And this is going to be a layer of clay or plastic on the bottom of the ground that's going to prevent pollutants from leaking into the soil and groundwater. Now, prevents is italicized because remember, even though we have all these systems set up, you always inevitably do end up with some of it somehow getting out. But this liner is going to be doing its best to prevent these pollutants from leaking out. Additionally, we have this leachate collection system. And this is going to be a series of tubes and pipes that are at the bottom to collect leachate. Leachate is going to be water that drains down through the waste, and it's carrying the pollutants. And this is actually taken out and treated or disposed of. So if we look at this diagram here, we've got this leachate collection pipe at the very end. This gray one is pumping it up into like an actual treatment system. We also have a methane recovery system, which is this represented pipe that we see right here in the middle. Now, remember that methane is actually like a flammable gas, and so you need to be careful. You don't want this to be like building up in a contained area. So we have these methane recovery systems as a system of these tubes and pipes that collect methane that is produced by anaerobic decomposition of things in the landfill. Now, a cool thing that we could theoretically use, as far as that methane could then be harvested and used to generate electricity or to heat buildings. So that's a way to kind of make our landfills have another purpose that is not often used, but like can be for a dual purpose here. Now we also have a clay cap, and this is going to be what you see like at the top here on this. The liner part is the bottom, the top part is the clay cap. And this is going to be typically more like once you have filled up this section of the landfill. And it's going to be this like clay soil mixture used to cover the landfill once it's full. This is going to keep out animals, it's going to keep in smell, and it's also going to allow vegetation to regrow. So it's kind of like a way of restoring the environment. Now, if you've ever been to a landfill, it's not really going back to like the natural ecosystem. They're usually just grass fields, but at least it's better than nothing. So when we're looking at landfill contents and talking about this idea of decomposition, where I mentioned like methane being released from it, it's important to be aware that landfills actually generally have a very low rate of decomposition because they have low oxygen levels, low moisture, and the lower levels of the organic material. You need all of those things present in order to get decomposition. And so we typically are not getting this within these landfills. And so we're going to have actually little decomposition occurring. So landfills are generally going to remain about the same size as when they were filled because things aren't like breaking down in there. Now, this can actually be shown by an actual like person was going through to prove how little decomposition occurs. And this was a 40-year-old newspaper that was taken out of a landfill. So after 40 years, this newspaper was still in like great condition and hadn't broken down at all. So this kind of just gives you a visual for how little breakdown is actually happening within these landfills. And right here, this diagram is kind of showing you how long it would take for this trash to decompose, which these are going to be like under these typical conditions here, which we don't have the oxygen and moisture conditions. But even so, like an apple core versus a plastic bag, like we're talking tons of time here, and we aren't even getting those conditions within the landfills. So here are some things that should not be landfilled. Hazardous waste like antifreeze, motor oil, cleaners, electronics, car batteries, metals like copper and aluminum, because these should be recycled. We have recycling systems for them. And then also old tires. So this is a weird thing. For some reason, College Board really wants you to learn this random fact. It is in the required CED that I need to teach you. It also has shown up in FRQs. So like this one might seem random, but just remember it. Old tires are something that should not be in landfills. Now, the problem is that unfortunately, because they're not supposed to be thrown away, a lot of times people just leave these old tires like piled up. And as you can see in this picture, they're going to be able to collect standing water. Standing water is going to be a place that is a breeding ground for mosquitoes, which mosquitoes can carry different types of diseases and yeah, so just not ideal. And again, I'm not totally sure why College Board feels like this is the one that you really need to know, but like you need to know it. So just know old tires shouldn't go in a landfill. When they get piled up, standing water, mosquitoes. Just kind of a quirky apes thing that we're going to accept here. All right, so what are things that should be landfilled? Cardboard and food wrappers that have too much food residue and cannot be recycled. So like a really gross pizza box with all sorts of like cheese and drippings on it, that should go in the landfill. Also rubber, plastic films, and wraps. Styrofoam. However, some places do have recycling options. My local landfill here in Tacoma, they do take styrofoam recycling. But if your local landfill does not have an option for recycling, styrofoam would need to go in the trash. Also, food, yard waste, and paper can go in landfills. However, they should be recycled or composted. So they aren't like hazardous. They can go in there, but like more ideal if they're recycled and they're composted so that we have a much better system for them. So here's going to be some issues that we get with landfills. Landfills are going to have environmental impacts like groundwater contamination and the release of greenhouse gases. Groundwater can be contaminated with heavy metals like lead and mercury, acids, medications, and bacteria if this leachate leaks through the lining into the soil and groundwater beneath. We also are going to get greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide and methane. They are released from landfills due to decomposition. Although there isn't tons of decomposition happening, it does happen. And so that's going to be releasing carbon dioxide and methane. And both of these are greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming and climate change. Now, here's an issue, not necessarily from the landfills, but something to be aware of. And it's this idea of not in my backyard. And it's the idea that communities don't want landfills near them for a number of reasons. First of all, just the smell and sight, they aren't lovely to look at. Landfills can also attract animals like rats and crows and gulls. Also, there are concerns about the groundwater contamination, especially if that is where your water is coming from that you are drinking. So ideally, landfills should be located far from rivers and streams and neighborhoods in order to avoid this water contamination. But people will like actively lobby to not have landfills in their neighborhoods because they don't want them. Which leads us to, first leads us to this diagram that shows all the ways that landfills, if they get into the groundwater, can cause problems. Now, what this actually originally was meaning to get us to is a social justice issue when it specifically comes to landfills and this conversation, because since most people don't want these in their backyard, we predominantly are going to have landfills being located near low income or communities of color. Low income communities or communities of color, because due to lots of issues with our society and history, often these are the communities that don't have the resources or the political power to fight against these decisions. And so your more privileged people are going to be the ones saying, I don't want a landfill in my backyard. So then it's going to get moved to these more underrepresented communities who are not going to be able to fight it. And so that's going to be something that is going to be contributing to it's like a continual cycle. It then lowers property values, which continues to decrease the economic value for people already in marginalized communities. And I could go on about this for longer and longer. Come chat with me if you'd like to know more about it. But this is a problem that we get with landfills, is that it is often going to be located in the areas where people are not able to advocate for it not being in their neighborhoods. So some other issues, not necessarily related, well, yes, related, but fringely related. So one thing to be aware of is that waste can be incinerated, burned, to reduce the volume that needs to be landfilled. So since most of this waste is like paper, plastic, food, they are hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen molecules, it's going to easily combust at high temperatures. So we could theoretically reduce the volume by 90% of our landfills. However, the problem with burning it is that it releases carbon dioxide and air pollutants like particulate matter and SOx and NOx. Also, the bottom ash may contain toxic metals like lead, mercury, cadmium, and is stored in ash ponds, which we have talked about can end up leaching out of these storage ponds or be released into the atmosphere. But it's kind of, what more do you want? Do you want more landfills, or do you want more air pollutants? Kind of take your pick, but we do have the option to burn it if that is something that needs to be done. This is an image here that can show you kind of those storage ponds, which we've talked pretty extensively about this in this class. So hopefully y'all are aware now that those can end up having flooding and leaching into groundwater, which can cause more problems with this method. Now, it also can be burned to generate electricity, which we covered. We're going to cover this a little bit more in our 8.10 notes, so stay tuned. But that is the thing that could be done if we are incinerating it. Now, one problem that comes, this is one that's kind of slightly related, is we do get illegal ocean dumping occurring in some countries where there are fewer environmental regulations or lack of enforcement. So when we start having too much of this waste, maybe the landfills aren't quite able to handle it, we end up with illegal dumping in some countries. Now, plastics especially are going to collect in large floating garbage patches in the ocean. And these are just going to be areas where we get large amounts of plastic. It's not just floating on the top, it's like deep down as well. But because of the way that the tides and the circulation, they all kind of end up migrating to these central areas, the garbage patches. Now, one of the problems from all of this plastic and garbage is that it can suffocate animals if they eat it. It can entangle them so they can't fly or swim, and they may starve to death because of it. This happens tons in marine organisms. So this is going to be a practice FRQ for 8.9. We're going to revisit this diagram here that I showed you at the beginning of these notes. So this diagram is going to be the municipal solid waste stream composition of the United States. So I want you to propose a solution the federal government could enact that would reduce the volume of waste entering landfills in the U.S. by at least 15%. Use evidence from the graph above to support your proposed solution. And that is going to be your practice FRQ on 8.9, and those are your notes on 8.9.